Hi, I'm Constance Duke, Director of Sustainability at Sustain Life. This is the Week in Sustainability, where our team of practitioners get together to talk about some of the most important issues in sustainability this week. I'm joined by my colleague Nick, who's a senior manager within our technical practice, and Ben, our senior manager of sustainable solutions. Ben, why don't you start us off with some good news?
Great. Thanks, Constance. So it is week 2 of COP, but some of the biggest news is coming from outside of COP. Actually, the G20 Summit, a cohort of countries, including the US, Japan, Canada, and the EU, announced an initial $20 billion in public and private sector financing to help Indonesia reduce its reliance on coal power. The deal is known as a Just Energy Transition Partnership, or JETP, and it builds on an initiative originally announced with South Africa last year at COP26. There's 3 goals to this climate financing agreement. The first is to facilitate the early decommissioning of coal-fired power plants. Second is to mobilize private sector capital to finance decarbonization efforts. And the third is to deliver a just transition for citizens of that country. The announcement comes with several new targets and policies to reduce GHG emissions and support impacted communities by peaking total power sector emissions by 2030, capping power sector emissions at 290 metric tons of CO2 in 2030, down from a previous peak of 357. Establish a net zero emissions goal for the power sector by 2050, 10 years earlier than the previous target, and accelerating deployment of renewable energy. So generation makes up at least 34% of all power generation in Indonesia by 2030, which is roughly double the total renewables deployment from the previous plan. While this is not enough finance to fully transition Indonesia's power sector to 100% renewable energy, JETPs are meant to send a market signal that catalyzes additional investment in decarbonization and potentially represents a turning point in the long-running climate finance agenda. Other JETPs in various stages of development include Vietnam, Senegal, and India.
Yep, that's definitely exciting.
hmm
Um, yeah, a lot of good climate finance news coming out of COP. I'll have another COP adjacent news topic to share. So a lot of you have probably heard this, but the US and China are restarting climate talks. This is great. They stopped speaking in the summer amidst security issues. There were some trade issues too, and then the visit to Taiwan by the Speaker of the House of Representatives. But on Monday, after a 3-hour meeting, they agreed to resume talks on transnational challenges, which of course include climate change. China and the US are the largest sources of fossil fuel emissions in the world. And so activists at COP27 were watching this meeting pretty closely in hopes that it would just provide the right market signal. We don't know at this point if this will result in any formal agreements prior to the conclusion of COP27 this week. We do know that the climate envoys for both countries did not have any formal negotiations, but they have known each other for 20 years, so they definitely spoke informally. And so why is this important? Couldn't the two countries just separately pursue decarbonization? And of course they could. And in fact, China installed about 80% of the world's new offshore wind capacity last year. The US passed the IRA. But we know historically that, if there is cooperation between the largest emitters, it motivates other nations to also cooperate. And, of course, if the highest emitters don't cooperate, then why should lower emitters do anything? And we've heard that argument quite a bit. There's an optics advantage for China, who's often kind of seen as the climate villain. So this cooperation does position them more as a leader. And then we all know that friendly competition spurs innovation, and that is exactly what we need in this fight to mitigate the climate crisis. And what do you have for us, Nick?
Speaking of the climate crisis, a report released this week by a group called Rebuild by Design, which is a research and design group at NYU's Institute for Public Knowledge, released a report called the Atlas of Disaster, which is basically a piece of research where they were looking back at climate disasters of the last 10 years in the United States. Really great report. Highly recommend that people go out and take a look at it because it's highly visual. It's very interactive. They basically put together a profile for every state in the U.S. and they characterize every state according to climate disasters, federal assistance, social vulnerability, nice maps, nice visuals. Um, part of this is just to understand the nature of climate disasters and especially from a spending perspective. So what they found was basically 90% of all U.S. counties have been touched by a federal climate disaster in the last 10 years. So it's not just like California and Florida. It's much more pervasive than we might initially think. And then they lay out some recommendations for ways to increase funding because the climate disasters over the past 10 years have cost the U.S. nearly $1 trillion in damages, 750 billion. And so obviously we need a way to pay for these damages, but also to raise money for climate resilience, which we've talked about before. So really fascinating report. We'll include the link in the description. And then a couple of updates from elections. We mentioned a few weeks ago, there were a few ballot initiatives in New York and California. The New York Green Bond Ballot Initiative, which was going to raise $4 billion towards climate resilience initiatives, passed, which is great. I live in New York, so I'm very happy about that. The California Prop 30, which was going to raise taxes on multimillionaires in California, actually failed by a pretty large margin. And I think we'll include some links as well to some articles about maybe why, but part of it is because the governor came out against it for unclear reasons. But yeah, you can read more about that if you're interested. So those are my updates.
Yeah, awesome update. Before we go, I just want to quickly mention one other major event this week, which is that the world population crossed the 8 billion mark. If you guys remember back in 2011, when we crossed 7 billion, everybody was kind of panicking about this relationship between overpopulation and climate change. And, we understand obviously that consumption patterns are far more important in this than the actual population size, including the consumption of fossil fuels, of course. And, so family planning, empowering women, all still very, very important. But to tackle the climate crisis, let's keep our collective eyes on overconsumption, which I suppose is a bit of a PSA as we go into the holiday season. Anyway, that concludes the week in sustainability, and we will see you next week with more commentary. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.